that's gonna be there for now. While basically I just we can why don't we if it's okay with you, why don't we just take a minute and just quickly tweet the fact that we're gonna be starting in a minute or two.
Okay.
Alrighty. Yeah, while we're doing that, how's the day been for you?
Warm was nice.
Yeah, nah. Did you have a chance to get out for a bit?
It.
Okay.
How was it for you?
Oh, I was able to go for a walk earlier in the day. So it was nice in Toronto, basically where I am. It was like 20 degrees. So I don't think we've had a day that nice in months.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah. Uh, I actually are you? I assume Are you in Canada? Uh, or
Ottawa.
Are you
Ottawa.
in Ottawa? Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
So it
Okay.
wasn't quite as warm.
Microphone. Uh, and okay. All right. Let me see if. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Just. I'm trying to see if this is working. I'm not seeing the. There's a certain like kind of Discord section that's a Discord voice that's supposed to be there, but I'm not seeing it for some reason. Give me a second. Give me a second. I'm just having some technical issues. Okay, voice and video, and let's say Realtek digital output. Okay. Okay, so that's not working. That's problematic. Okay, so Realtek audio, Realtek audio. Sorry, this worked. This worked last time, so this is where I'm a bit confused on why this is causing problems. Uh, okay. So let me check the properties. Okay, speakers, Realtek audio, Realtek digital output. Let's see here. Does this work? Nope. Nope, that doesn't make it work. Okay, let's say here. Let's say Realtek audio. Okay, this is problematic. Let's see here if anyone's in stream. Nobody is yet. Okay. Sorry about this. I had a whole basically Discord thing set up to make sure there weren't any issues, but I'm gonna have to go and check that quickly. So I'll just put this to be right back, and we'll try to sort this out for to make this work better. Oh, wait a second. Oh, Steven, I'm sorry. This is my own fault. I actually need to go to the main chat. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay, that solves the problem. All right. Yeah. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. But there we go. I let's just say that feature caused me a lot of problems in the beginning. But okay. So now that's working. Let's go to live scene with background. Okay. So now it's gonna be a question of okay, right? Speakers, real tech audio, and Just try speaking.
Okay, hello.
Okay, terrific. It's working. All right, we have the
Okay.
all clear to go then. So, after the technical issues, hello, people, to yet another episode of the Injona Show, hosted on Twitch, and there's a few other channels as well. If Twitch just is not the platform for you, yep, I am. I'm joined by quite a special guest, in fact, and that is Stephen Gowans. So, Stephen, could you just quickly introduce yourself for maybe people that don't know who you are?
Yeah. First of all, I should say I don't like talking about myself, so
Yeah, you
this is
don't have to
always
talk for
difficult.
long. No worries.
I guess what's relevant here is that I'm the author of 3 books, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and one on the role that Israel plays in U.S. foreign policy. And I've also been a blogger for more years, I think, than I can remember.
Out of curiosity, when did you start up the blogging?
Oh, probably about 20 years ago.
Oh, damn. Okay, you've been blogging for longer than I'm alive. Puts it in perspective. Yeah. Well, funny things, eh? Anyways, yeah. So basically, uh, obviously, part of the reason why I wanted to bring you on is, and I have the article up on the screen now. You wrote a really interesting article around the vote on declaring a so-called quote unquote Uyghur genocide. Now, obviously, I've already written a piece kind of looking into the committee and kind of showing the charlatans that were chosen to testify. It was pretty much a show trial just to justify a vote eventually. But you kind of expanded upon that and kind of went in a different but really interesting direction. So I'm wondering why did you pick this focus in terms of more of a general focus on this narrative?
Okay. Well, to help me out here, so you say I went in kind of a different direction
A
than you
similar
did.
it's a similar focus. It's a similar focus, but I'm just curious I guess, and it might be an easy question, but what particularly sparked you? Would it be the parliament vote? I reasonably assume.
Um, yeah, I wasn't so troubled by it. Well, I was troubled by the parliament vote, but I'm just troubled by the effort to slander China. Um, I'm troubled by the Western information war that's being waged against China. And the parliamentary vote was just one instance of that. So um, it didn't precipitate my opposition. It was, I mean, I've been writing about what I've been calling the Uyghur genocide smear for a number of months, or maybe I can't recall the first article that I wrote, but this is just a continuation of these efforts to slander China, and it will continue. It'll be, the Uyghurs, and then it'll be Tibet, and then it'll be Hong Kong, and then it'll be Taiwan, and who knows what else, or something about COVID.
Yeah, for sure. There definitely is quite a, and I've written about it myself. I mean, as well, that there is just quite the concerning, uh, really pattern on that front. So let's actually take a look. Just go into the article now. I guess basically for people can you maybe before we get into just digging into the details, what's the general direction you take in this piece?
Well, um, what I do is I approach this question from 4 perspectives. First was to look at the geostrategic context. So to inquire into whether there might be some ulterior motive that the Canadian Parliament had in declaring that China was engaged in a genocide. So that was the first question. The second question was to look at who was behind the accusations. What are their motivations? What are their politics? The third perspective was to look at how the accusers define genocide. Because if you make an inquiry into this matter, you'll see that some of them have an odd or idiosyncratic definition of genocide. And then finally, the last perspective I took was to look at what evidence there was that, in fact, a genocide has been undertaken. But I think one has to look at this, both from a political perspective and then maybe some from a kind of a legal perspective. One of the things that troubles me, not only about the Uyghur issue, but about so many, is that people are willing to believe accusations on the face of it without actually exercising any skepticism or asking questions. It could be that accusations are true, but I think one has an obligation to look at who's making the accusations, whether they have ulterior reasons for making the accusations, and whether the accusations are backed by evidence. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. And it certainly didn't happen in the case of Canadian parliamentarians who, if they were honest about what they were doing, couldn't have undertaken an investigation or couldn't have exercised any degree of critical judgment. And if they're dishonest about this, well, then I guess the question of critical judgment is kind of moot. But
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I'll just jump in to give people like a little context now. Basically, in terms of before we get into the vote itself, I do want to mention a little bit about like the committee in a short sense, in that it was just such a tremendously problematic one, in fact, because as you've written a ton, Stephen, about some of these CIA cutouts, these NED funded organizations. Basically, surprise, surprise, it was them who were really prioritized. It was pretty remarkable, and one of the things where I'm not sure if you actually had a chance to read through the article, but there was this executive director of a Uyghur rights advocacy project that directly states that it is funded by the National Endowment of Democracy for its advocacy work in Canada. So literally, it was started and funded exclusively by the NED, and so he and also multiple MPs who were on that committee, basically that led to the report that ended up leading to the vote. Multiple of them joined the Parliamentary Uyghur Friendship Group in late February 2020. So he testifies in late July. There was no disclosure of the conflict of interest. And also, even if you disclose that conflict of interest, the fact that basically these MPs were already in a group saying with Friends of the Uyghurs, basically, which basically is saying we've made our mind up. This is a show trial, a show trial, or I don't know, maybe better phrase than that. But really, and I said this basically, even for people who have more leaning sentiment towards it, I really urge them to think. Do you think that people that have already joined a parliamentary friendship group that is explicitly in favor of one perspective on this issue, do you think they're really the impartial judges that are actually needed to determine what they're committing genocide or not? Basically, especially when this witness is part of the same basically parliamentary friendship group. It was genuinely nuts. It really was. And then and we'll talk about this more as you go through the article, but like some of these people basically some of these institutions really, like the East Turkestan Government in Exile, basically ASPI, Uyghur Human Rights Project, Campaign for Uyghurs, and also rather disappointingly Canadian Labour Congress as well. They've had not such very great foreign policy and great actions for, to be honest, quite a while. Yeah, and I'll ask you something about like the politicians and such themselves later on, but I just want to give that give that context. Um, yeah, do you have any
Well,
thoughts there?
well, as you were talking about this, I was thinking of continuity and your remark that I've been blogging longer than you've been alive. And that took me back to the first days of my blogging were concerned with issues related to the NATO assault on Yugoslavia in 1999, and also efforts to overthrow the government in Zimbabwe, which had undertaken a land reform program. And a lot of the work I was doing then was looking at civil society organizations that were involved on the ground against those governments. And these civil society organizations were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, or they're founded by the Canadian equivalent.
Yeah, like
And you,
CETA or Rights and Democracy, were I think the two
yeah,
that we have pretty much.
indeed. And you could discover this quite easily. In fact, all you had to do is go look on the websites of these various organizations, and they disclosed who was funding them. And it was almost invariably, be the NED or some other kind of US or Canadian or German or French government agency. Um, uh, kind of, well, at the time I was engaged in a lot of correspondence with groups that were working in Yugoslavia and were presenting themselves as on the ground left-wing groups. That's the way they like to present themselves, that were opposed to what they called dictatorship. And were representing, they said, the common people. But in fact, were funded by major NATO governments in the United States. And in the conversations I had with them, they always denied vehemently that they had any connection to any kind of foreign government and that they were independent organizations. Well, living in Ottawa, I meet lots of people, and many of the people I meet are involved in the government. And on occasion, many years later, I met someone who had been in Yugoslavia on behalf of the Canadian government. And she didn't know that I knew anything about Yugoslavia, and she was talking about what she did there. And what she did there was exactly what I had argued that the Canadian government had been doing in Yugoslavia, which is providing funding to these essentially overthrow groups. And this she acknowledged. Right. So this kind of thing is, it just goes on and on, year after year after year. And it's always the same methods. It's always the National Endowment for Democracy or some other kind of so-called civil society group, which acts as a proxy for Western governments in trying to destabilize or overthrow foreign governments that are unwilling to be subordinated to the will of the United States and all of its vassal states like Canada.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I wanted to ask you because you made a really interesting point. I'd be interested in hearing you talk more about both of the countries you mentioned. So, Yugoslavia is one in a bit, but one of the things I want to, I guess, maybe an actual connection there is in terms of the ostensible, what people tend to think of as the left-leaning opposition in the NDP. Now, was there any opposition within the party back with Yugoslavia to the bombing campaign there?
I can't recall. Now, I can't say for sure. If I wanted to post-stick and go back in time, I would say that if you went and checked, you'd probably find that there are a few, perhaps, MPs that were opposed to the bombing, but I would suspect that the party as a whole wasn't. However, I could be mistaken. I can't recall.
So it looks like basically the NDP. I'm looking at the links. I'll pull up a link that I'm looking at the side. So it looks like I believe the conflict started in 1997. Am I correct in that sense?
Well, I'm thinking in particular what I was interested in at the time was the bombing campaign that NATO undertook in 1999. for about, I think it was about 3 months.
Oh, you're talking about
I,
1991. Okay, that makes
I,
sense. Fair enough.
in advance of that, there were, oh, even advance and after that, there were efforts to overthrow the government through civil society organizations or proxies of the West.
Yeah. So from what I can tell, basically, they did support the NATO bombing campaign actually. So I just want to mention this, and just a connection to basically the to like the present day and the case in the vote with Xinjiang, which was the fact that bar I think there was three NDP MPs, though maybe there was one more, but I believe it was Nikki Ashton, Don Davies, and maybe there was one more who abstained from the vote, but not a single NDP MP, basically including Matthew Green, voted against that bill. So I mean, like, I guess I can ask you more for your thoughts on that because yet again, you have quite the experience. Is the NDP really these kind of key wars? The way I'd put it is the imperialism that's genuinely challenging to oppose, whereas like something like supporting Cuba or like Bolivia is mostly a pretty safe position for these social democratic parties. Um, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are there.
Well, there's also a parallel between Yugoslavia and the Uyghur events. And that is that the pretext for the war in Yugoslavia was that the Serb government was committing a genocide against the ethnic Albanians. And there were pronouncements made by NATO officials that once the Serb government was overthrown and you could bring forensic people into Kosovo, that you would discover there was a killing field and that there were tens of thousands of people who had been thrown in the Trepka mines. So that was the justification. Once the government was toppled, the war was over, and these forensic scientists were dispatched to Kosovo, they were quite angry. And they were quite angry because they realized they'd been betrayed, that in fact there was no genocide. There was nothing even close to a genocide. This was a complete fabrication used as a pretext to get rid of a government that Western governments wanted to get rid of. So there's a nice parallel there. I wouldn't say nice, but there's a parallel there. But as regards the NDP, this always reminds me of something that Paul Sweezy once said. Talked about parties like the NDP or their parties they call themselves social democratic or progressive, that the one enduring characteristic of these parties, these progressive parties, is that they progressively barter away principle for votes and respectability. And that's been true for over 100 years. They always behave in the same way. So, I'm disinclined to think that NDP MPs who voted for this parliamentary statement, were simply ignorant. I think they probably had some political calculations that involved vote getting and trying to be respectable in mainstream society. And the way to be respectable in mainstream society is to appear to be against things like genocide, and certainly don't want to challenge the idea that there's a genocide being undertaken, because then you might be called a genocide denier. It takes it takes some courage to be able to exercise critical judgment in politics, I guess. And I don't say that to excuse them in any way. I say that perhaps to explain their behavior. But I think if anyone's expecting any kind of principled stand or principled position, principled behavior from the NDP or the Green Party, then they're going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
I should
Go ahead.
I should just quickly add, for all of those who are disappointed, there, I did tweet. I mean, I saw the statement by the Communist Party of Canada, which was actually a very good statement on. I mean, it was the only party that had any kind of reasonable statement on this accusation against Uyghurs. It was well reasoned, it was cogently argued, and it was the one party that showed any degree of critical judgment and any kind of principle.
Yeah, we actually I just pulled up the statement. I was fortunate to have Jay Watts on the stream Tuesday night, and so yeah, no, I would have to agree. It's definitely encouraging, at least, to see the Communist Party be one of the few forces that opposes and has a pretty good record of opposing imperialist wars. Yeah, because for me, and also my case is that I came into like kind of activism and these kind of things originally before I was an activist before I was a journalist, basically, and so when I came into it, I was already pro Palestine. I was pro a lot of these things that were kind of in conflict with the NDP's policy, but being from the family I kind of was, that I got caught up in the, oh, you can fix this, that, oh, it's not a pattern, and it's I even like, I'll be honest, like, and I use this as an example of the fact that basically what I say actually has a meaning value to it, because I was on a writing executive. I tried to argue these things. I tried to argue that there's these points that need to be actually changed, and made a factual case, made these efforts to break it through. And the thing that I learned is, yeah, like you said, basically, that it's votes, it's sacrificing principles for votes, and there's a reason why after about like 5-6 months on the executive, which admittedly the last few months I pretty much wasn't on it. I'd kind of been disillusioned pretty quickly. But yeah, no, like I know some people in the anti-war movement are nicer, basically on the NDP, but for me, someone being directly and cogently kind of like within that party, and basically having tried to make some efforts, and like seeing what they've done to anyone who acknowledges Palestine, basically the apartheid against Palestine, and challenges imperialism really in any really serious way. Yeah, to me, it's pretty obvious that, like I said before, the NDP really isn't going to be the one you should be relying on to actually oppose these wars in any sort of really consistent measure. And I mean, like, and I'll mention someone who I have tried to play nice on for a while, but I mean, like, someone like Matthew Green's been extremely problematic. He's been really, really problematic. He's someone who really does push himself as anti-war, and he's done some decent stuff on Bolivia and Cuba, but he kind of follows this theme in the party that basically they'll oppose the imperialism that's easy to oppose. Like, Cuba is not a challenge. It's basically not really much of a challenge for Social Democrats to defend Cuba or to defend basically Bolivia. But you see him like going headfirst into the Xinjiang genocide narrative, basically calling Andre Domise, who's not someone who basically is gonna just go about and run around and make claims and make support without providing evidence, but he called Matthew Green out, and Matthew Green refused to respond in any substantive manner, called him a tanky. I even like directly reached out and showed some articles linked to gray zone content, linked to the report that I had done on the committee, and he just basically refused to acknowledge anything. Really acted in just kind of a sarcastic, snippy kind of manner, and I think I don't know, and I don't know what your thoughts are there, but I mean, for me, basically, I see him as he'll continue to oppose basically conflict against Venezuela to a certain degree, and against like Cuba and Bolivia, but in any ones that are seriously challenging that might threaten a future leadership bid, for example. To me, I just don't see it as any smart play for the anti-war movement to try to rely on him. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I don't think. I mean, if you're anti-war, anti-imperialist, and you think that the NDP is the vehicle for that, then I think you're probably mistaken, and you're going to be disappointed. I mean, there are people who are anti-war, anti-imperialist, who are socialist, who are in the NDP, and their great dream is to push the NDP to the left. That doesn't happen. And you could ask the question, well, why have you put yourself in a position where you're going to be continually disappointed by a party that takes positions at odds with your positions, when, in fact, and this sounds like maybe I should finish my sentence and then I'll qualify it. When in fact there are other parties that have positions that are consonant with people in the anti-imperialists and socialists, but they ignore those parties and instead cling to the NDP. Now, in saying this, you might think that I'm a member of the Communist Party of Canada and that I'm trying to promote the party. I'm not a member of the Communist Party of Canada, so I don't have any vested interest in saying what I'm saying. But I've always been curious about people who stick with the NDP and are continually disappointed by the NDP's positions and don't really have an analysis of why the NDP has the positions it does, and believe that somehow, through great effort or persuasion, they're going to push the party to the left. I mean, people have been trying to do that for decades and decades and decades, and it hasn't happened. And there's no indication that it's ever going to happen. Perhaps the party might shift to the left if there's a general shift within the larger society to the left. But I don't think it's ever going to be pushed to the left through activism or effort or energy or persuasion. Because, I mean, even if you do an analysis, if I was an NDP MP or MLA and I was interested in being elected, I would recognize that most of my constituents are interested in local affairs or national affairs and don't really have an understanding of foreign policy, nor do they have an interest in it, and they're never going to have a very good understanding of foreign policy. Their understanding is very superficial, and it's based on headlines and what they hear about the Chinese are doing terrible things to the Uyghurs, and the Serbs are trying to eliminate these ethnic Albanians, and Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe is a dictator. They always call them dictators. So if I wanted to be elected, it seems to me that the worst thing I could possibly do would be to say, I support Zimbabwe, or I'm opposed to the measures we're taking against Zimbabwe or against China or against whichever leader who's been called dictator you want to mention.
Yeah, you know what,
So
actually... Oh, sorry. Keep going ahead, but there's something I do want to ask you about after you're done.
So I can understand the behavior of NDP parliamentarians and legislative representatives. I understand why they behave the way they do. But
Yeah, for sure. And, you've talked about Zimbabwe on multiple occasions. I think even I'll admit that Zimbabwe is the area that I'm not so informed on. I mean, could you kind of give people a breakdown, in your view, what the situation, the historical kind of situation in Zimbabwe, and where you see the kind of lies in the kind of NGO influence being peddled within that region?
yeah, well, Zimbabwe is interesting because, if you look at South Africa and you look at Zimbabwe achieved its independence, its political independence before South Africa. But it had to address the same kind of problem, and that is the problem that you had this white minority of settlers who owned all the land. And that issue of land redistribution has never been settled in South Africa. And it wasn't going to be settled in Zimbabwe either until the Zimbabwe government decided that it would have to take very strong measures to what they called democratized land ownership, which was to redistribute the land the white minority to the black majority. The model that had been imposed initially on Zimbabwe and South Africa was one of the so-called willing seller, willing buyer, which meant you could redistribute land if the owner was willing to sell it, but you couldn't expropriate the land. Initially, the British, who had initial colonial masters of Zimbabwe, which I think called Rhodesia, had said they would help the Zimbabwe government buy land from the white minority, and then they reneged on their promise, at which point the Zimbabwe government said, we're a poor country, we don't have the means to purchase the land from this white minority of settlers who stole the land from us in the first place, so we'll just take it, we'll expropriate it. And this is perceived in the West as a great affront to the whole idea of property, at least as Western governments defined it. But from the Western perspective, it's all right to take someone else's property. In the case of taking the property of the indigenous people of Zimbabwe, but it's not all right for the indigenous people to take their property back. So Robert Mugabe, who until he embarked on this land reform program had been feted in the West, now suddenly became a heinous dictator. And he was treated much the same way, Xi in China is treated. They call it Xi, but authoritarian. And Mugabe was called a brutal dictator, and the West imposed very draconian sanctions on the country to starve it. They're still in place to this day. And they built up civil society to try and overthrow the government of Zimbabwe. They even, to the point of essentially funding another party, which they called the Movement for Democratic Change. So, I mean, there's this pattern that goes on over and over and over, one country to another. I mean, any country that has the audacity to challenge what the philosopher Domenico Lucerdo called the international dictatorship of the United States. Any country that's a resistant state that's going to challenge that dictatorship is going to find that the United States will apply in various ways, one of which is to fund society organizations as proxies or as overthrow organizations.
Yeah, for sure. It's particularly interesting now. I believe Mugabe was he overthrown in a military coup? Or
well, there was a coup. It was yes, essentially yes. It becomes quite complex.
yeah. So I guess what was your view on that incident? Because yet again, this is when you talk about Zimbabwe. This is remarkably interesting for I think not only my audience but myself as well, who hasn't really seen much of a left like a genuinely anti-imperialist take on this issue. Like what were the kind of the factors into this coup?
On that, I cannot provide a highly intelligent answer because, to be honest, I kind of lost interest at that point. But I mean, there was a conflict between Mugabe's party, which is called ZANU-PF, and the Western-funded party, which was the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change. Mugabe was quite an elderly president at the time that he was essentially overthrown by his own party, whereby there became a factional dispute within his party about who would succeed him, and one of the factions won, and the way they won was essentially forcing Mugabe to step down and to cede power to the leader of the faction. But ZANU-PF remains in power, and the United States is still trying to oust ZANU-PF. Just recently, they renewed the sanctions they had in place on Zimbabwe, so the sanctions continue.
For sure.
So
I guess. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
oh no, you go ahead.
I was gonna say. I'm particularly interested. Was there like a? You mentioned basically like what was the Canada? What was like the Canadian role in this in essence? Was it kind of more of an NGO front? Because we've had the RCMP come into Haiti. We've had basically our military come to Haiti directly, so we have different forms of interfering in any country that doesn't just follow the Americans' every desire.
Well, I mean, the Canadian role is, as it mostly is, as you know, a supporter and vassal state of the United States, so it takes its direction from the United States and tries to help the U.S. where it can. I don't. Canada certainly didn't have a significant role relative to the United States or Britain, which really played the lead role there.
All right, that's totally fair. We've gone about a few subjects for a while, so why don't we get back a bit more onto the subject of this case yourself. So let's talk about the geostrategic the context, right? So why is Xinjiang basically the region that basically the U.S. and Canada, taking the lead from the U.S., are choosing to really try to destabilize?
Well, I mean, it's not the only one in China.
Oh, of course, yeah.
What what an adversary will do is look for any kind of cleavage, ethnic cleavages, racial cleavages, linguistic cleavages that they can push on in order to destabilize or even to fracture a state. So when they look at China, which is a multi-ethnic, multinational country, they look at Tibet, they look at Xinjiang, they look at the Muslim population, and I mean, trying to foment kind of like secessionist tendencies within the Muslim population, or to set or to promote jihad against against the government is a policy that the United States has pursued for quite a number of years, not only against China, but also against the Soviet Union in its day, because you had a large Muslim population in Central Asia, and also against Soviet-aligned states. I mean, they played the jihad card against Egypt initially in the 50s, against Syria, against Libya, against any Soviet-aligned state. So this is simply an extension of trying to exploit Islam for U.S., geostrategic goals. And what the United States is doing is simply a continuation of what Germany had done in the First World War. I mean, Germany looked at Britain and said, Britain is actually the largest Muslim empire in the world, because there are 500 million Muslims under the control of the British Empire. And the Germans said, well, maybe we can promote jihad amongst those Muslims to destabilize the British Empire. And they tried the same thing in the Second World War. So this is a long-standing strategy or tactic.
So wait, just so I'll say that basically Egypt is especially interesting because obviously Abdel Nasser, in terms of basically he's obviously quite the interesting figure, and he's someone who I really think I should take some time to just listen to a documentary or something of sorts, because he seems quite the remarkable historical figure from everything I've seen and some of the speeches, clips I've seen from him. But you mentioned basically in terms of World War I and World War II, of weaponizing, basically of trying to weaponize Muslim population and trying to promote jihad. I mean, are you able to expand a little bit more on that, because that's quite a fascinating angle actually that yet again I'll say I honestly hadn't thought of.
No, it is. There are a number of books on this. I can recommend some of them. the Germans even had they called the destabilization department, whose job was to destabilize enemy states, and they invested a lot of time trying to destabilize the British Empire by pressing on grievances that the Muslims would have had with British colonialism. There's a book called The Berlin-Baghdad Express by Sean Meakin, which looks at that effort to destabilize the British Empire, or to weaponize Islam, as you put it. There's another book that was written about Nazi efforts to do the same, which is called Islam and Nazi Germany's War. And then there are other books that have been written about the United States' efforts to destabilize a whole variety of countries by weaponizing Islam. Before they did it before the most recent efforts in Syria from 2011 forward, but they'd also been doing the same in Syria in the decades prior to that. So this is what's going on in Xinjiang, is simply a continuation of this long-standing German and U.S. policy.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's tremendously fascinating to have that angle, because I think it provides like an even deeper historical context to the fact that there has been these kind of efforts for, frankly, more than a century. In fact, basically by various states in various cases with various different targets. But yeah, it is quite fascinating, and I mean, one of my favorite episodes of RT's, I think it's called The Underground. Basically, was one kind of looking at basically, in terms of the Middle East and kind of in the Muslim world, but the kind of the communist or at least socialist kind of leftish leaning basically movement in that region during the 50s and 60s, and how basically the U.S. funded Saudi Arabia and their right wing version of Islam that basically led to basically these countries kind of, some of them adopting a more conservative lean. So it is really fascinating. You see that basically, whether likely intentional, but whether intentional or not, these kind of long game plays really do have a big effect over time, and a big effect in policy up to this very day. So.
Yes, and I cover a lot of this in my last book, which was Israel Beachhead, which looks at Israel's role in Western imperialist policy from an historical perspective. So it looks at things like Nasser, who you mentioned, and the weaponization.
Yeah, for sure. You've definitely written some tremendously interesting books, and I think there's one or two books we'll get to. The other two books you've written to, we'll definitely get to them in time. But yeah, so let's get to the people behind the accusations. Now, I've talked about it a little bit, but is there anything new that maybe, or anything that any groups and such that we haven't really touched upon that have been part of driving this accusation?
There's been a lot of focus on one individual, Adrian Zenz. There's been a lot of focus on his characteristics as a fundamentalist Christian, and perhaps looking at that as motivation for slandering China. And I suppose one could reply, maybe he isn't slandering, maybe as a fundamentalist Christian, he honestly believes that China is engaged in some kind of abomination against the Uyghurs. But I would go beyond that, and what I found more interesting are the groups that Zenz is associated with, which are not fundamentalist Christian. One of the groups is the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and another is the Jamestown Foundation. The Jamestown Foundation has been publishing some of Senz's work, and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is an organization at which Zenz is a senior fellow. Now, these are interesting organizations because they are anti-communist organizations whose raison d'etre is to bring about the demise of communism, and which is, I mean, the most significant incarnation of communism existing today, well, the People's Republic of China. So could it be that organizations that are dedicated to bringing about the demise of the People's Republic of China might have an interest in producing material that discredits communism and calls it into question and foments opposition? So we look at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I mean, this was created by the U.S. government and if you can go and look at their website, they talk about, we seek to free the world from what they call the false hope of Marxism and to save it from what they call the tyranny of communism. When I looked at that, what struck me was that was exactly the leitmotif of Hitler's political career. Not very many people read anything that Hitler wrote these days, and maybe not many people read it before, but if you do read what Hitler wrote, you'll discover that his main preoccupation was Marxism and communism and bringing about the end of what he would have called the tyranny of communism or the false hope of Marxism. So the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Hitler come from the same kind of intellectual tradition that's opposed to essentially movements of equality, movements seeking equality in terms of freedom from exploitation or equality across peoples, equality between the sexes, etc. So the goal of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is to educate future generations that, they say, Marxist socialism is the deadliest ideology in history. And they are agitated by what they say are positive attitudes toward communism and socialism in the United States. They say that these attitudes are at an all-time high. So the foundation exists to call into question Marxism and to reverse these attitudes. And of course, one of the ways you can do that then is to suggest that the People's Republic of China, this incarnation of communism, is engaged in a genocide, the most heinous act, but then that would be consistent with their view that communism is the deadliest ideology in history.
Yeah, for sure, and it definitely contextually makes a ton of sense, basically, that these groups really would want to go about meddling really and kind of spreading his narrative. So now let's talk about like in terms of the genocide itself, because you had an interesting section basically now looking at asking the question, right? How do these accusers now? Can you talk about like how they define genocide?
Yeah. They like to talk in terms of the Convention of Crime and Genocide, how that convention defines genocide. And the way that convention defines genocide is that it's an act committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, religious group through various means, killing members of the group. And no one is saying that the Chinese government is killing them. Causing serious bodily harm or mental harm. And saying that the Chinese government is doing that to Uyghurs. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Not accusing China of that. forcibly transferring children of a group to another group. No one's accusing China of doing that, and that leaves us with the last measure, and that is imposing measures intended to prevent births in the group. That is what China is being accused of, and indeed in the motion of the Canadian Parliament, specifically that measure that has been referenced. So the accusation is that China is preventing the births of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim populations in Xinjiang. So that's one definition. So then you can ask the question, okay, is this actually happening? And the argument this is happening comes from research that's done by Adrian Zenz, the report that Adrian Zenz has done. And that report looks at family planning policies in Xinjiang. And what Zenz says, what he says, in fact, doesn't even make the case that the Chinese government is preventing births. It says, previously, Han Chinese couples, so the ethnic majority of China, Han, previously they were limited to one child. So this was the famous one-child policy of the Chinese government implemented in 1979. But Uyghur couples were allowed 2 children in urban areas and 3 in rural areas. And the family planning restrictions were not rigidly enforced on the Uyghur couples. Well, today, Han Chinese couples are permitted to have as many children as Uyghur couples are permitted, so they can have 2 children in urban areas and 3 in rural areas. And the family planning restrictions are now rigidly enforced. This change from lax to rigid enforcement has been accompanied by a decrease in the Uyghur birth rate. And that's because you have a change. I mean, it used to be that the Uyghurs were producing more than 3 children in rural areas and 2 on average in urban, and now they're limited to the same number that everyone else is limited to, and that's reduced the birth rate. But the Uyghur population continues to grow despite enforcement of family planning policies. Uyghur couples are not prevented from having children, notwithstanding what the Canadian Parliament believes. They're only limited in the number of children they can have, and family planning rules apply equally to Han Chinese. So if you want to say that, and Zen's, take that back, those who are promoting Zen's research say, or try to say, that China's family planning policies are such that they are leading to a genocide with respect to the Uyghur population. Well, if that's true, and in 1979, when Beijing introduced its one-child policy, then Beijing must have been carrying out a genocide against the Han Chinese majority. And of course, no one's willing to say that because that's an absurd statement. So this is just trickery, playing games with words to make it appear as if China is engaged in some kind of genocide. And people within government know that this isn't true. And we know that they know that this isn't true because the U.S. State Department lawyers told the previous U.S. Secretary of State that there is absolutely no evidence there's a genocide in Xinjiang. And there isn't. I mean, this is simply playing with words to create the impression that there's a genocide. And indeed, if anyone truly believed that there was a genocide, they wouldn't accept the news so, with such great toleration. And I don't see anyone suggesting that anything ought to be done about this. It's simply an accusation that's made to slander China. And there'll be other accusations made to slander China as well. So just be an ongoing thing. The mountain and mountains of slanders. all based on these kinds of assumptions and innuendo.
Yeah, for sure. It really is a historical habit of these kind of patterns, really of destabilization and really just smears that are quite frankly just meant to destabilize. So yeah, basically, I guess my question then would be, in terms of let's say basically, first of all, I'll ask, like, what are your thoughts on the American media and like their role in kind of pushing this narrative? And I'm talking more about mainstream and some like social democratic left leaning ones.
Social democratic left-leaning ones
Like Democracy Now. Yeah, Democracy Now is kind of like what I'm referencing when I say social democratic types.
Yeah, they provided Adrian platforms. But you know what I would say about Democracy Now is I'd say about an NDP, members of parliament, MLAs, which is I don't think they take particularly well. They're again, we could evoke Paul Sweezy and say their history is one of progressively bartering away principles for respectability. I'm not sure what more one can say about Democracy Now.
Yeah, that's totally fair there. Yeah, I guess my question would be like generally on the Canadian media. I guess my question would be, what I'm particularly curious on how you thought like media in this country as well, whether that's probably just a very simple front or whether our media has played like a different role. And I'll bring up an example for context, which is the CBC platforming someone who I talked about, Mehmet Toti, basically, and how he was part of this directly NED funded group. He was basically put on, from what I could see, just tracking YouTube for like 2-3 days. He was on in that time period 3 or 4 times alone, basically with no disclosures of his the funding connections and his background there. So yeah, with that in mind, do you think they just simply play a similar role to like a Democracy Now or just an NBC News, or do you think maybe there's anything particularly dangerous about how they've gone about spreading these smears?
Well, I mean, you could analyze bias from so many different perspectives and at so many levels, but I'll offer this one. I worked for many years as a researcher, and what I discovered as a researcher was that if my findings and conclusions were consistent with what people wanted to hear, what people believed, that was great, because there was no controversy and my life was easy and no one scrutinized anything that I did. The moment my findings were at odds with the common understanding or with odds with someone's political position or a mainstream political position, or were at odds with what people wanted to believe, life became very difficult for me. It became very difficult because I was challenged on everything. Everything that I did was scrutinized. And so people learn. I mean, it becomes a system of rewards and punishments. And they learn what it is that you say to be successful and what it is that you shouldn't say to be successful. I mean, these same kind of contingencies must operate in the media. But that's only one level of explanation for media bias. Other explanations as well. But I think that has a large role to play. And that too can explain, as I tried to previously explain, the behavior of people in politics as well, politics.
Yeah, for
If you want
sure.
to be
Oh, sorry.
principled, if you want to be principled, and if you want to take a courageous stance, then you have to be courageous, and you have to also suffer the penalties, or be prepared to suffer them.
Absolutely. And
Otherwise, it
so,
won't be easy.
yeah, no, I did. It definitely is not. Basically, it's not put together to be an easy fight, but I mean, it's a worthwhile one. So now you mentioned basically the targeting of Syria. Now, and I did want to transition to that because you've read a whole book on the war of Washington against Syria. So now, basically, I think people would be generally aware at this point to a certain degree about the war on Syria, whether it's the sanctions, like the funding of these like jihadist groups, basically. But what is I guess I'd ask to start is kind of like what is Canada's role here? Like what has Canada's role been in terms of the Syria conflict or the war on Syria?
Well, Canada doesn't have an independent role in Syria. Canada doesn't have an independent role in much of anything. Canada is simply an extension of the U.S. state. CSIS is an extension of the CIA. The Canadian Armed Forces is an extension of the Pentagon. The Canadian government is an extension of the U.S. government. We completely facile state which behaves in concert with the United States. So, and that's why we don't hear much about Canada, because Canada is trailing along after its patron and boss, the United States.
For sure, I can totally see that. So yeah, then now that we've talked about that, let's get into the conflict in Syria. Now, what are the dimensions? What are the dimensions of the war in Syria? Is it a kind of mixed game? Is it more of an economic focused? Is it economic focused? Is it basically militarization focused? Or is it more of a mix of the two?
You mean on what levels is the war being against
Yeah,
Syria?
essentially yes.
On so many, yes, there's an economic warfare, sanctions, not only denying the Syrian government access to its resources. I should point out that interestingly, there are a number of occupation zones in Syria. There's what I call the U.S. occupation zone. It's often presented as this is the zone where the Kurd allies of the United States have taken control. The Kurds are simply the tip of the U.S. spear. It's a U.S. occupation zone, a military occupation by the United States, which is completely illegal. And this from a country that proclaims to be a champion of rule of law, yet is trampling the rule of law in Syria as it does in so many other places. There's the Turkish occupation zone, which is where the Turkish military is in Syria illegally, one of which is Idlib, which has been called by one U.S. official the largest Al-Qaeda safe zone in the world. And there is also very few people who acknowledge this or recognize this. There's an Israeli occupation zone. And my Arabic pronunciation is really poor, but I call the occupation zone in Al-Qinitara, which is the Arabic word, but it's otherwise known as the Golan Heights. And Israel has occupied that Syrian territory since 1967. It pirated that territory in 1967, ethnically cleansed, pirated 2/3 of the territory, ethnically cleansed the population, and then changed the name to the Golan Heights, which is what is now known as. So, and also we have French forces in Syria illegally, Turks in Syria illegally, Israelis in Syria illegally. And why are the Americans in Syria illegally? And they're quite open about it. Why are they there? To what they call secure the oil and to prevent the government in Damascus from accessing that oil and also accessing the agricultural resources of the U.S. occupation zone. Because if they're able to do that, they might be able to rebuild. And the U.S. aim is to ensure that after sponsoring this jihadist proxy war against Damascus since 2011, destroying the country, both through this kinetic warfare and also economic warfare, that Damascus never be allowed to pick the country back up and rebuild.
Yeah,
There's also indications that the U.S. intends to make its presence in Syria permanent.
That's I mean, unsurprising, but especially that's in fact especially interesting.
But the most interesting question for me here that often isn't answered is why. People don't ask that question. So why would the United States want to wage this long war in Syria? What is it that motivates them? What is it that they hope to accomplish? I mean, you can talk in these abstract terms of that. Well, they want to impose domination, or they want to dominate the Middle East absolutely. They want to crush resistance. But why do they? Why do they want to dominate West Asia? Why do they want to dominate the Chinese? Why do they want to dominate everyone? What end? And I think that there's very little attention being paid to the economic imperatives that drive the United States to behave in that fashion. Economic imperatives that relate to the way in which the U.S. economy is organized.
Yeah, for sure. And I think basically there's a great basically article I want to reference in terms of the general view in terms of basically sanctions on Syria, like Iran in general, by this really sociopath and U.S. government now official in Richard Nephew, which is like the core motivation of these sanctions and that push is so inherently sociopathic. The whole goal really is basically to do regime change at any cost, and that is the most important aspect of it. Is any cost. That is there is no level they will not stoop to basically to go ahead and actually take control and basically get what they want, really.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It's horrific. The blood they'll spill, people will starve, millions of people will starve, crush. It's almost difficult to comprehend.
Yeah, and it's just something that absolutely really must be opposed, quite frankly. And I think, as we've emphasized both in the previous topic, really is just that that pure electoralism at the end of the day isn't really going to cut it. It isn't going to cut it, and basically, if we're serious about change, then other methods are going to have to be taken. So I guess there's one more topic I want to talk about, just because I want to get to the book that you've written, Patriots, Traitors, and Empires. the story of Korea's fight for freedom. So I'm kind of curious there. What was the driving point for you to basically go about and start to write this book?
I wrote this book at a time when there was concern about North Korea within the Western world and attempts to demonize North Korea as a country that was, this view, this narrative was being led by insane dictators who were going to develop nuclear weapons with the intention of destroying the world. So it was written in that context. You don't hear that narrative much anymore. It seems like the Western world has moved on to China and seems to be less concerned about North Korea. But that might be explained by the fact that at the time there was a concern in the United States about North Korea developing the means of its self-defense. If it developed a viable nuclear weapons program, then the United States would no longer be able to launch military, would not be able to bring about regime change in Pyongyang through military means. There have been various attempts to bring about regime change in Pyongyang, but at a certain point it was decided that, you know what, that whole society is just going to collapse anyway, the way in which the Soviet Union did. So it's just a matter of waiting. Then at a certain point it was discovered, you know what, looks like they're far more resilient than we thought, which is what the US government would say. And so maybe we're going to have to use military means to topple the government. But we need to do so quickly because North Korea may arrive at the point where it has a nuclear pistol on its belt, and we won't be able to launch a military strike. It seems that since that point, North Korea has not only looks like perhaps perfected being able to miniaturize a nuclear warhead, which could place at the top of ICBM, but it also seems to have developed an ICBM that can strike the United States or can strike multiple cities or any city in the United States. And that may account for why we don't hear much hostility toward North Korea, or as much as we did. I mean, obviously, Washington is still hostile to North Korea. It's been hostile to North Korea for well over 7 decades, and it will continue to be hostile. But it's no longer rattling the saber. The North Koreans make the point that, in fact, their nuclear weapons were deterrent to aggression and have stopped the war that looked like it might have been inevitable. But Korea has a very interesting history, and the North Koreans have a very interesting history, and I thought that history or that the war that was going on against Korea at a particular moment should be looked at within historical perspective. And that we should understand North Korea as it is rather than the way in which Washington wanted us to understand it.
Yeah, for sure there. And I just wanted to get to that just quickly because it's probably one that, admittedly, in terms of topics, it isn't the most topical, but definitely I'd urge people to go and check out the book and just consider taking a careful look, basically, into like the history around the DPRK, or known as North Korea. Basically, to take a look into the war against Syria, really. And yeah, I mean, I think that's probably, I think realistically, it for now. But I guess I want to give special thanks, obviously, Stephen. Thank you for coming on to the stream. Is there basically anything basically you'd want to plug or you'd want people to particularly know of?
No, I'll just say very quickly, just to close. Yeah. Another thing, what makes North or Korea very interesting is what we believe about North Korea and what we believe about South Korea are probably the inverse of reality. So if you want to find out a little bit more about Korea and why the reality is different from what we would like to believe, then you can check out that book. And I'd also like to thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no worries there. I definitely I'm very happy to have had the chance to have you on. You've obviously done a ton of great work in writing and research over the years. So, yeah, the thanks goes your way as well. So, yeah, if people want to if people want to check out your work now, where would you link them to?
Gowans.blog.
So Gowans.blog, that would be, yeah, and we the article that I was referencing basically through a lot of the piece that was on his blog. So I will drop that right in the Twitch chat if you want to go and check that out. The plugs for me, basically, if people want to support the journalism and the streams, the easiest way to do it if you're watching on Twitch already is go and follow the channel, or you can even subscribe to the channel as well to provide some financial support there. Go check out my Twitter. It's Aiden/Jonah. And obviously go check out the Canophiles site. It's just www.thecanophiles.com. Anyways, thank you so much, Stephen. Thanks so much to the audience for all coming on. And that'll be the end of the stream. Catch everyone later.